Hi there. Hello. Welcome to the Sophos MDR ThreatCast July 2025 edition. My name is Greg Idden. I'm the security architect or services architect now. I keep forgetting my title. Services architect for Sophos MDR. Joining me today, we have Dan Inglis from Threat Intelligence, also Morgan Dembowski from Threat Intelligence, as well as then Paul Jaramillo, who's director of Threat Intelligence and Threat Hunting, who will also be taking us through some interesting bits of content. So what we're going to be covering, we'll be covering the usuals. We'll do the threat landscape. Dan's going to take us through what's been going on in the wider world, what's been going on in the news, what might be important, vulnerabilities, and so on. Morgan's then going to take us through the observed threat activity, what we've been seeing and observing in Sophos MDR itself. Then Paul's going to take us through the threat hunting highlights, just selecting a couple of interesting threat hunts that we've conducted over the last 30 days and take you through how that kind of works to give you an insight into what they do. Then I'll take us through the Sophos XOps review as we're taking a break while they're working on their pipeline. So I'll be doing the XOps section. I will also, I've not added it to the agenda, but we'll also be bringing in the most unwanted section as well. So that'll be here. So stick around till the end to get that covered, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. But as always, we always get this question somewhere. If you have any questions whatsoever as we're going, we've got the Q&A panel over on, I believe, the right-hand side of your screen. So click in there, ask a question. I don't believe we're publishing them publicly because we want people's names revealed. I don't think we can do anonymous questions on this platform yet. But what we'll do is we'll either answer your question either via text in the chat. We'll hold on to it and bring it up at the end of the Q&A section, or we'll answer it live. I'll interject and bring it forward to the presenter if it's really important and it seems really relevant to what they're talking about. And yes, this is being recorded. The video recording, all the references for the content that we covered today will be uploaded to the Sophos MDR community channel within roughly the next 24 hours, sometimes a little bit longer. It depends on how long it takes the video to get uploaded. And we'll also show the references at the end as well if you want to see them. All right, that's enough of my voice. Let's bring Dan on stage. And Dan, why don't you take us through the threat landscape? All right, thanks, Dan.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Welcome, everyone. And thanks for attending this month's ThreatCast. So to kick off the landscape section, we're going to start with a fairly serious vulnerability that's gained some notoriety as the sequel to Citrix Bleed. So CVE 2025-5777 is a memory disclosure flaw that can leak sensitive session tokens and credentials in Citrix NetScaler ADC and gateway appliances. So the big problem here is that this can be exploited without authentication, and exploitation in the wild has already been confirmed, with some reports suggesting that this exploitation began almost over a month ago in mid-June. What's especially concerning here is that the leaked memory can include valid session tokens, like I said, which attackers can use to impersonate users, including admins, without ever needing to log in. So Citrix has released patches, but many of the systems are likely compromised before they're applied. So if you're running any affected appliances, patching is critical, but it's also really important to do a compromise assessment. So it's important to look for things like unusual NetScaler admin logins, stream session behavior, or any unauthorized changes to the configurations. You should also invalidate any active sessions, rotate credentials that were used throughout this period. And just in short, if you have a NetScaler appliance in your environment and you haven't already responded to this, you should treat it as a potential breach. The reason this is important is because the original Citrix Bleed vulnerability was known to be exploited by multiple ransomware groups, and it's very possible that similar groups may target this vulnerability in the same way. All right, moving on to a couple of Chrome vulnerabilities. So first up is CVE 2025-6554. This one is a type confusion bug in Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. Essentially, this is responsible for running any JavaScript inside the browser itself. So it was discovered in late June and patched shortly afterwards. However, Google confirmed that the vulnerability itself had been exploited in the wild before the fix was released. So in practice, this means that all a user would really have to do is visit a malicious webpage, and then that site itself could exploit the bug to execute code directly in the browser. So there's really no user interaction required beyond visiting the page. So then just a few days later, another Chrome vulnerability popped up, this time CVE 2025-6558. This one affects Angle, which is the graphics layer in Chrome that handles any GPU rendering. So the danger here is that this allows attackers to escape the Chrome sandbox, which is one of the key protections preventing browser bugs from affecting the rest of the system. However, when you pair this with another render exploit similar to 6554, this could actually lead to a full system compromise. And so just like the previous bug, this was also actively exploited before the patch was released, making this another 0-day. So what's the big picture here? So these are the fourth and fifth actively exploited Chrome zero-day vulnerabilities so far this year, and we're only in July. So it's a really strong reminder that browsers remain a hot target for attackers, especially given how much sensitive data and how much access is tied to them. So for defenders, keeping Chrome and other browsers up to date remains absolutely critical as a first-line defense. But since 0 days often hit before patches are even available, it's equally as important to have additional protections in place. So for example, a good EDR solution can spot post-exploitation activity, like a browser spawning unusual processes or persistence attempts, for example. All of these are signs that something else is going on. And to wrap up the vulnerability section, we're going to talk about the recent SharePoint 0 days. So to back up a bit, a few months ago at Pondome Berlin, a security researcher demonstrated a SharePoint exploit by chaining together an authentication bypass as well as an insecure deserialization bug. So these vulnerabilities were later assigned to CVEs 2025 5974, 49704 and 49706. And so when combined, they allow remote attackers to upload SharePoint files to a SharePoint server and achieve remote code execution. So as part of the attack chain, these adversaries dropped web shells, which were used to extract the machine's cryptographic keys. And it's these keys themselves that the attackers could use, leveraging a separate tool to execute code arbitrarily. One particular web shell that we saw actually offered some additional capabilities as well, such as uploading files and issuing remote commands. And this gave attackers persistent access to the compromised environment. So these two bugs were patched on July 8th as part of Microsoft's Patch Tuesday release, but things started to heat up a little over a week later on July 18th, when multiple researchers and vendors, including us at Sophos, began seeing widespread exploitation of these vulnerabilities in the wild. So it quickly became clear that the original patches didn't fully mitigate the threat, and attackers were still able to exploit the flaws, which led to the discovery of patch bypasses. So, and these were then later assigned to additional CVEs. That's 2025 53 770 and 771. And so over the weekend, Microsoft quickly rushed out additional updates to close these gaps. And then just yesterday, Microsoft published a detailed blog outlining their response to the tool shell campaign, as well as shedding light on who's actually behind the activity. So according to their telemetry, exploitation actually began as early as July 7th, a full day before the patches went live, meaning that the original 49704 and 706 vulnerabilities were actually exploited at 0 days. They also attributed the campaign to multiple Chinese actors, two of which were state-sponsored, and those are Linen Typhoon and Violet Typhoon. And there's also a third group they track as Storm 2603, which is a cluster that they're still analyzing, but Microsoft says is also based in China. However, it's important to note here that now, since proof of concept code has been published publicly, it's possible for really any number of low-skilled threat actors to exploit these unpatched systems. So you can't immediately link any exploitation attempt to China, for example. Before moving on, I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some of the amazing work that we did and my colleagues did on this incident. So across the teams, everyone from Intel, threat hunting, and operations all worked extremely close together. So like I said, we first saw exploitation begin on the 18th. And once operations noticed the patterns and exploits, they quickly escalated to the threat hunting team, which ran point on the investigations. That then worked the operations to identify even more exploited servers and escalated everything to the impacted customers, and also helped them remediate the attacks. And by the end of the day, on the 18th, just a few hours after discovering the initial exploits, we published a broadcast to all MDR customers, warning of the attacks and providing advice. We also worked with our labs team to ensure we have proper detections to detect post-exploitation activity. So if you're interested in reading more about what we saw or any of our protections, we published a blog on this earlier in the week, which you can actually access by scanning the QR code here. So I'll give everyone some time to scan that before I move on. All right. Okay, next up, let's take a look at FileFix. This is a new social engineering technique that builds on what we saw earlier in the year with ClickFix. So with ClickFix, attackers would trick users into opening the Windows Run dialog and pasting in a malicious command. FileFix takes that same principle but shifts the execution path into the File Explorer. So instead of Windows plus R, FileFix guides victims through a fake file verification or repair process. Users are told to open the File Explorer, press Control L, which then focuses on the file address bar, and then paste in the command that was copied to their clipboard when they landed on that site. So at this point, hitting Enter would run a PowerShell script that goes unnoticed by the user. So now they could really do anything they wanted with this command, but something that's actually been observed in the wild has been the delivery of interlock rat. So this remote access Trojan runs from the user's app data directory and immediately performs system profiling, checks privileges, and even scans the local network. It also sets up persistence through registry keys and maintains contact with the C2 infrastructure through Cloudflare tunnels. The good news here is that some of the same defenses that help mitigate against ClickFix can also help block FileFix. So disabling the run dialog via group policy and restricting PowerShell to signed scripts can reduce some of the exposure here. But really, the human element remains the biggest challenge. So it's really important to emphasize that you have ongoing user awareness training. All right, and lastly, so sticking with the theme of social engineering, we're going to pivot from fake CAPTCHAs to fake coworkers. So within the past month, both the US DOJ and the Canadian RCMP released advisories discussing how thousands of North Korean IT workers have been getting jobs at companies as either freelance or contract developers. So these individuals are using fake or stolen identities, typically American, and applying for remote jobs through common hiring platforms. So once hired, they blend in, they write code, they attend meetings, they do all the things a normal developer might do. But then behind the scenes, some of them are they're sending some of these funds back to the DPRK to fund their programs, and they're also planting backdoors, which are used for later access. From a risk perspective, there's a few different aspects to consider. So firstly, you've got the obvious, the insider threat potential, where attackers can then exfil data or insert malicious code over time. But there's also a compliance and a legal angle too. So if you're paying one of these individuals, you might actually be violating some sanctions without even realizing it. And finally, there's also a third-party risk exposure. So even if your own hiring practices are really good, you could still be vulnerable through contractors or agencies that you work with. So it's a good reminder to vet your contractors and have a really strong identification process when hiring. And with that, I'm going to pass things off to Morgan to take us through our observed threat activity.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. How's everybody doing? I hope you guys are enjoying your Wednesday so far. Let's get into some fun observed threat activity. So we're going to start off with some of our recent trends that we've seen over the past month. So in the past month, Akira ransomware, no surprise, was the most commonly detected family. And they've just kind of continued to sustain their role as a persistent threat across our MDR customer base. I believe Akira has held the #1 spot for I think the past 3 months, with SafePay being a little bit less consistent. SafePay was our #1 top observed ransomware family in April, and since then has kind of hovered outside the top 5 until this month, where they were the second most observed. We usually see, in terms of Lockbit and Keylin, these kind of remain steady across, looking over across a multiple month period. We continue to see about 1 case associated with Lockbit 3.0 per month, and Keylin always tends to stay in the top 5 as well. Another group I will comment on is the Daxon team. This ransomware group has been active since at least June 2022, and they've historically had a pretty strong focus on the healthcare and public health sector, though they've also been seen targeting government, utility, and a range of other organizations. In terms of Sophos MDR, we've only observed 1 incident related to Daxon at the very end of June, where they were actually seen abusing a policy misconfiguration in an organization's Palo Alto VPN in order to gain access. And while Daxon is a relatively older group, and they seem to try to lay low a bit. I believe, looking back at some of their, data leak site postings, they've only had 1 or 2 over the past couple months. So I think that kind of signifies that with us seeing some increased activity from them, that they're definitely still active. And it could also signify that they are very carefully picking their targets to get the most bang out of their buck, rather than being more opportunistic in trying to catch a lot of different organizations in their net. In terms of initial access, we have two graphs here. One is top initial access vectors, and the other is top contributing factors. So initial access vectors, we actually track these as access avenues. And so these are the systems, or the specific types of assets that are used to gain access, while contributing factors are basically the how and the why of why those assets were compromised. So the most common access avenue that we see is exposed remote access, so typically VPNs or RDP. And the contributing factor in most of these cases is no MFA enabled. Oftentimes, compromised credentials may be involved, or in other cases, we may see brute forcing. But in this past month, Fortinet VPN and SonicWall VPN were the most commonly targeted VPNs for initial access, which really emphasizes how important it is to prioritize reducing, exposure of your edge devices that can serve as really easy entry points into your network. And then notably, we also saw a lot of incidents this month stemming from unprotected assets, which also really reinforces the need to secure those overlooked or those unmanaged internal systems, which can be used to pivot to various other hosts within the network. So that's an overview of our trends. Now we're going to get into some more specific examples here. So this activity we're going to talk about here involves a fake Chrome update leading to the deployment of an info stealer, which resulted in the later compromise of the organization's Microsoft 365 tenant and, unfortunately, access to several downstream customers. So how this incident kind of played out was, in terms of initial access, the user was seen searching for a term, I think it was supernova or something like that, in Google Chrome. And so they clicked on the top result, which redirected them to a malicious site that was masquerading as a fake update Chrome page. So the user clicked on the big Update Chrome button, which happened to download a malicious installer called update.msi onto the host. And then once this installer was executed, it launched multiple Chrome windows to mimic a legitimate update process, so kind of reinforcing the fact that it looks legitimate, and it began to drop a bunch of files. And I'm going to quote my colleague Jordan Olness here. He really summarized how this installer works quite perfectly. He said that the installer file was basically a malware clown car, and when it was executed, all sorts of malware began popping out of it. There were a few loaders carrying encrypted shell code payloads, and there was also a file known as dupe files cleaner, which is downloaded as part of the AOME Partition Assistant software suite, which was used to launch the info stealer, which was called orbitc.exe. So that info stealer then, proceeds to steal a bunch of browser cookies and sessions on the hosts. And then there was about a 20 day or so period of dormancy, and then we see one of those authentication session tokens stolen by the info stealer being used to authenticate to the target organization's Microsoft 365 tenant, which then allowed them to gain access to cloud resources without any authentication requirements. Around the same time, we saw access to other key applications like accessing SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. They were seen deleting emails from the user's mailbox, specifically mail with subject lines like security notification, login attempt block, or like critical security alert, anything that requires authorization. And most notably, they also used the stolen credentials to access the LastPass vaults of several downstream customers. And from there, they stole credentials and MFA tokens from those LastPass vaults and used them to authenticate to the Microsoft 365 tenants of those downstream customers. And this is kind of an interesting case because in terms of the breadth of activity that we saw, it is possible that it was related to one threat actor, but it's also possible that it could be the work of multiple threat actors, upwards of 3 that might have the same leaked session or credentials. So we saw the initial Microsoft 365 actor using that info stealer session. And then we also saw a credential stuffing Microsoft 365 attack using that same info stealer stolen session too. But this one had different IP ranges from the attacker. That indicates that it might be unrelated to the initial credential capture, unless it was publicly shared in some sort of dark web forum. And then there were also activity in one of the downstream environments where a VPN IP that we associate with a cluster that we track as Stack 3524 was seen being used to target their XG firewall. And so Stack 3524 is, we track it as an initial access broker and largely characterized by, they conduct a lot of credential stuffing of XG SSL VPN accounts. So it was an interesting case seeing all of these different indicators that point to the possibility of there being multiple actors involved. And it kind of bridges to an overall theme that we see in the threat landscape is, incidents are no longer very straightforward where one actor enters the network, conducts all of the activity, and leads to the impact stage. We're now seeing where multiple different actors have their hands within the same incident. And one initial access broker is handing off access to another actor who then hands off access to another. So it's important to keep those aspects in mind when it comes to analyzing big complex cases like this, that there might be more happening underneath the surface that we may not see. And in terms of advice, it's very important to try to prevent deletion of security alert emails. You can do this using exchange rules or by disabling user level email rules that can hide those security notifications. Additionally, it's important to regularly rotate authentication tokens and to proactively invalidate stale or inactive sessions that could be abused by threat actors. You can also enable alerting for session token reuse or suspicious OAuth token behavior, and you can do that in your M365 or your Azure logs. And then lastly, it's recommended to try to review third-party app integrations into M365 and try to disable unused or high-risk apps, because it's really critical to try to audit access to tools like SharePoint, like Teams, and especially LastPass vaults, especially in cases where those are used to manage customer data. Okay, so moving on to our next piece here. So this is about a potentially recently updated phishing as a service kit. So last year, our team had reported on Rockstar 2FA, which is a phishing as a service kit that we linked to a threat actor called Storm 1575. And that's used by various actors to steal credentials and MFA tokens. And our Rockstar 2FA was particularly notable for using car-themed decoy pages that would pop up when it detected like a non-legitimate victim or like a security researcher trying to access the page, which became a pretty good way for analysts to try to track the Rockstar phishing sites. But in December 2024, our team published a blog on the disruption of Rockstar 2FA infrastructure and the surge of a different phishing as a service kit called Flowerstorm. But now, Sophos MDR is investigating what appears to be a resurgence in Rockstar 2FA activity. So we began to observing new cases last month that bear pretty strong forensic resemblance to the original campaign associated with Rockstar 2FA, but also there's some pretty clear evolutions in their tradecraft. So one key overlap that helped us connect this new activity to previously associated Rockstar activity was the reuse of distinctive backend PHP naming conventions and also static intra-ID identifiers, which were patterns we previously associated with Rockstar 2FA. And these traits, along with the persistent use of a very specific app ID, point to it either being the same developer or at least a close affiliate of the prior developer. However, there were also several differences. First, the actor ditched the very recognizable car-themed decoy pages in favor of more generic document-based prompts like you can see in the screenshots here. We're also seeing a shift in how captured credentials are validated. So instead of data center infrastructure, the actor is now leveraging residential proxy services like IP Royal and Proxy Rack to test logins. And that kind of helps evade conditional access controls and increases the likelihood of what they hope is a successful account compromise. Additionally, we've also identified a new anti-analysis mechanism, which is a dynamic pause-in debugger, which tries to prevent sandbox browsers from capturing credential exfil posts. It should be noted that it doesn't completely prevent browsers from capturing the post actions. You just need to change a setting in your browser and you can bypass the protection. But it is a noted change from the earlier versions of the kit that didn't employ that kind of obfuscation. And then finally, one last difference that we've noticed in a recent hunt, our team discovered attempts to bypass conditional access by rotating through various IPs and proxies until a login succeeds. So in short here, moral of the story, while the front end lures of Rockstar 2FA have changed, the backend behaviors, the identifiers, and infrastructure show a strong continuity with the Rockstar 2FA kit that we reported on as disrupted in 2024. So it could suggest that this is either a reactivation by that actor, Storm 5075, or a closely aligned operator continuing the service kind of under the radar. So we're continuing to conduct research and dive into activity associated with Rockstar 2FA. And then we've got one last bit of observed threat activity here. This is on a new stack or cluster that we identified called Stack 4913. And this is a financially motivated campaign that we have seen primarily targeting German companies. So we most recently saw this campaign this month. And in this case, we saw initial access being gained through a fake resume that was downloaded from a malicious OneDrive link. And so while in the past, threat actors have also been seen conducting voice phishing, or what we call vishing, over Microsoft Teams, we didn't see that in this case. Instead, after the initial resume lure was downloaded, the user that was targeted, not knowing that it was malicious, they shared the resume to a different employee over Microsoft Teams and unknowingly enabled the threat actors to compromise another host. And so after they ran this fake resume, a sysinternals based backdoor that we have dubbed sus-sys backdoor was deployed with a malicious but valid digital signature as a persistent startup item. And after this backdoor was deployed, they were seen performing discovery activity over the next week or so. And then roughly a week after that initial backdoor deployment, we observed a unique PowerShell loader command execution where another custom sysinternals based backdoor was executed in memory by piping contents of temporary log files into PowerShell.exe and then deleting those files to hinder forensics. And as an extension of that, these threat actors also employed several other anti-analysis techniques and features, including specific command line arguments, password prompts, and unique execution keys. And after this, they're seen focusing on primarily credential access activity like plain text credential storage discovery. And upon them trying to conduct a remote registry credential dump, a Creds4H detection spun up an MDR case. And the MDR team was able to prevent further impact and evict the threat actor less than 2 days later. So in terms of attribution here, through the PowerShell malware analysis and the C2 usage that we analyzed, our team was able to identify malware overlap with what is known as the bad hatch or sardonic backdoor, which has previously been observed being used by a campaign that we track as Stack 4663 that has been seen leading to ransomware such as Fog ransomware. And there's enough evidence that, we can definitely say that Stack 4913 is distinct from that other cluster, but it is possible that the overlap may indicate that this cluster is potentially ransomware related or possibly even selling access to ransomware affiliates. In terms of recommendations, it's critically important to obviously educate all employees on phishing, but we have seen an absolute proliferation of job-themed phishing lures, specifically targeting human resources employees or HR employees. So malicious resumes, CVs, cover letters are sent over email to HR employees or even submitted on job platforms like Indeed. And we are seeing this across the board for many different, ranging from ransomware to just compromises to credential access. So it might be worthy to consider increased awareness training for HR staff, specifically on how to spot job application themed phishing lures, because it is kind of their job to open up a bunch of resumes and to review them. So it makes it very attractive to threat actors of, okay, how can I create the most convincing document for someone in this organization to open up? And they have, determined that HR staff is a very easy way to do that. And then also with this group known to use Microsoft Teams for vishing and for other actions, it's really important to restrict external Teams communication where possible, or even implement moderation or alerting for unsolicited messages from unknown domains. And then we also recommend to tighten up your application and process controls. You can audit startup items for unauthorized binaries, especially renamed or modified sysinternals tools like diskview.exe that we saw in this case. And then you can also block or restrict execution of unsigned or untrusted binaries from user directories, especially at startup. And I think that closes us out for observed threat activity. I will now pass it over to Paul to give us some insight into threat hunting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Morgan. So we've got a couple interesting threat hunts to go through. So with that, we can just dive right in. So starting off, this is a hunt that we haven't necessarily typically done in the past, but I wanted to highlight it for you guys just to show that we're constantly kind of evolving and adding in new types of hunting techniques. So with this particular hunt, we've decided to look at different files and executables that are impersonating Sophos binaries. So the idea for this, origination for this, came from our operations team. I believe we had seen a case a month or so ago where the threat actor created a malicious binary called CryptoGuard, which you guys should know is the ransomware protection that Sophos has. However, there's not actually a CryptoGuard exe on the system. It's run at a much lower level in the kernel. So they were able to take advantage of, just hiding in plain sight. You may be familiar with CryptoGuard, so you wouldn't think that it would be malicious, but in fact, that file shouldn't be existing. And that's what they've done for over 20 years at this point, pretending to be Microsoft files. So that was the origin of this particular hunt. And we did uncover one impacted customer and submit a new detection opportunity out of that. And so what we were able to uncover here was actually something that had been reported as also masquerading against Sentinel-1 as well. So this tool is actually called Grixpa, and it's an obfuscated.NET application. It does actually require a encoded XOR key to run, which may at least adds a little bit of control for the attacker so that it isn't ever accidentally executed, or at least somebody analyzing it at least has to brute force the XOR key to get it to run. It's kind of like a multifunctional / reconnaissance tool. You can see here it's IP port scanner. We'll enumerate, do some discovery on process activity and network routes, and try to capture browser data to facilitate, additional credentials to expand their compromise. And then it also exports the results into an export data.db. And like I mentioned, you can see in the screenshot there kind of a static representation of the attributes of the file that was masquerading as Sentinel-1. This is in fact detected by a Sophos signature as well, Trojan agent BLIE. So you have coverage there. And then I'll dive into the other aspect that I wanted to highlight for you that makes this notable. So we haven't typically hunted this way. So this query that you're seeing here is a little bit different. You'll notice that the table that we're looking at is the MDR IOC table, and that's going to be our detections. And so we're specifically looking at low level, almost an observable, like a low level detection. Think of it as like a severity 1 or severity 2. Fires for something pretending to be Sophos. And we have to keep it that way because there's just so much noise that would occur if it was case creating. It's just kind of a standard practice for a lot of small IT shops, small developers to repackage other people's tools as their own. And that messes up the image file basically. So that's the detection that you see there, which is the masquerading Sophos image detection there. And then further in the query there, you can see the different locations that we're looking for, and that yielded the detection that we're looking for. So it was a nice little hunt here that kind of demonstrates that we're looking at hunting not through just traditional techniques, but kind of trying to harvest what we are seeing, with those low-level alerts that maybe aren't getting looked at. So I thought this was an interesting one to highlight here. And we're always looking at opportunities to look for threat actors abusing Sophos and trying to evade Sophos. And that's definitely one of our core missions with threat hunting. Moving on to the next one. So yeah, Morgan definitely highlighted the amount of Teams phishing and vishing that's going on and, trying to steal credentials. And another one that's really hot as well is, using SVG images. So with any type of malware, they're able to embed a malicious link inside of the image. And then that image is essentially, when it's loaded or viewed, the JavaScript is able to execute and download additional content. And then they're, in this case, redirecting to a fake Office 365 login page, which we've seen a tremendous amount of activity there as well. And we were able to uncover 3 different systems that were compromised with 2 unique customers, and an additional detection as well was submitted. So diving into this a little bit further, in SVG, people are familiar with this. A lot of people are familiar with SVG if you'd worked with websites or any kind of design or high-res graphics, but it's not necessarily typical like a JPEG or a GIF with a hard G. So the image can be inline or it can be attached. So it's not necessarily anything that would raise suspicions that this image would be coming through. Once it opens, though, it's going to, like I said, it's going to run through that JavaScript and execute it and redirect you. The URL in many cases is completely just random letters and numbers. So it's not a legitimate looking URL, but the URI looks very much like a Microsoft login author, the same exact string that you would see in a Office 365 login. Notably, the attacker, I guess this is common practice now, they reverse your email address and then harvest the images from your organization and load that into the phishing page to make it more realistic. So it looks just like what your Office login would look like. And then a little bit of anti-analysis, they do try to hide behind Cloudflare, which makes it a little bit more challenging to analyze the actual source of the hosting provider. And you can see there from the image just a little bit of insight into what the email looks like and then the embedded code within it. And you can see it's, I think Morgan mentioned this, it's caught, and, it's a call to action. It's a to-do, you must be doing this. It's your boss or HR saying, hey, we need you to take a look at this. So people are trusting, and this seems to have been very successful. Now moving on to the actual query itself. So this particular query is going to be more like our traditional queries, not like the first one I showed you. So we're basically going in and looking for the command line and trying to extract out anything where there's a URL, inside the command line, which by itself definitely isn't malicious. There's system, scripts that will do that. And so that's hence why we have to hunt for that. And then we're extracting additional information, and then followed down by the bottom, you can see where we're specifically looking for the URI with the auth2 string, and then filtering out the known Microsoft domains there to get to the actual redirects that are malicious. So that one there is very straightforward. However, this next one, apologize in advance. There's only so much you can do. It's a long query, and so to prevent it from breaking up across multiple screens, this particular query, we have to do quite a bit of regular expressions to extract IP addresses out. So you'll see that in the very first half of the query, we're extracting out IP addresses, session IDs, user agent, things that are going to help us track this activity across a single threat actor. And then towards the bottom is basically we're just looking at raw-based indicators. So we're looking at a known IP that we've observed that's been sending these types of threats to see if we can uncover any additional victims. So that's the SVG phishing threat hunt. Like I said, that's really definitely something along with Teams-based phishing as well. Phishing, something to keep an eye on because that seems to be very widely observed at the moment. And then to wrap up, what I'd like to do is give you guys a reminder. The threat hunting monthly report gets sent out, and you will get a broadcast email, and then you can see at the very bottom there's a highlight in yellow where you have to actually download the report. And so once you do that, you download the report from your own central instance, and then you can see the details of the hunts that we provide. So I realize not everybody has the time to take a look at these, but if you do, I think you'll find it pretty insightful. We go into a little more detail. So a lot of the hunts that we can't talk about on the call, you'll be able to dive into that and see how we're protecting you. So with that, that wraps up our threat hunting section. And I believe, Greg, you are next with the XOps.
Thanks, Paul. That was awesome. Alrighty, okay, let's dive into the XOps review. So, as always, XOps and the wider kind of Sophos community has been putting together lots of interesting content. I'm going to try and touch on these. I got 6 to touch on here, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. So the first one, which came out just the end of last month after the ThreatCast, was called "Taking the Shine Off Breach Forums." So where they go in and kind of dig into the kind of takedown of the Shiny Hunters group and how and the breach forums, which is a kind of a common forum used by threat actors, or was used by threat actors to communicate about the various breaches and tactics and techniques and so on. It's been offline, I think, for a while now, but a nice little write-up. The next one is using AI to identify cybercrime masterminds. So this is where sort of our researchers were looking at how to use, I would say probably more like machine learning techniques like k-means clustering and so on, but machine learning and other sort of, I guess, in the wider field of AI, techniques to sort of look at communications on sort of dark web forums, actually start to look at who's communicating with you, what kind of things they're talking about, and start building clusters of like what kind of things that they're interested in, what they're focusing on, and so on. Really interesting read, really interesting bit of research. Then, of course, there's the July Patch Tuesday. I think there was like 40 something. Don't quote me on that, but there's about 40 odd, crazy number of remote code execution vulnerabilities, which included some of those SharePoint ones. But of course, as we all know, with the sorry, I'm going to call it tool fix, but with the SharePoint vulnerability that came out on the weekend just past, yeah, there was other aspects to that. So lots of things to patch. Certainly worth looking over to understand what's been going on. The next one is the Sophos AI Black Hat. So for any of you attending Black Hat in August, I think it's like August 7th or 8th, around that time, a bunch of our Sophos AI researchers are going to be talking about anomaly detection and how they actually sort of create a kind of supervised machine learning technique to use sort of like an anomaly detection for command line executions alongside language models and so on to build a really kind of clever system. Really interesting talk that'll be coming up. Then, of course, we have the SharePoint tool shell vulnerability that happened over the weekend. We've already talked about this article, but again, worth going and check that out, especially if you're still using SharePoint on-prem. And then we've got Small World, the revitalization of small AI models for cybersecurity. So this one's touching on rather than, everyone's sort of talking about large language models or LLMs as being kind of like the big thing, and they require, huge, amounts of compute, huge amounts of memory. And this is sort of looking at how, especially on specific tasks, smaller models are actually incredibly efficient and effective at detecting things, and how the AI team is, of course, we are using, LLMs for, many things, but also how there's still lots of opportunities to create kind of purposeful, focused models that are much smaller, much more efficient, can run far quicker, work on far, vaster amounts of data in short space of time. Really good bit of research kind of off the back of that sort of Black Hat talk as well. Alrighty, let's jump now into the Sophos MDR Most Unwanted. So this is an image that we'll be adding to the community blog post that you can then share with your end users to try and sort of level up their security awareness. So this month, as you probably might have guessed, we're going to talk about that file fix phishing attack. So this is where, threat actors are, trying to social engineer people and get them to run malicious code. And in this instance, this new technique called file fix. And it sort of explains, the lure. They'll ask you to click like a button. It'll open up a file browser window, which I think is crazy that this works. But then, so to click fix with the run dialog, please run this code using Windows key run. So the same thing, takes them through that and tells them not to run, follow these instructions and alert your IT and security team about the website so that they can be blocked. Right. So nice little summary, but to give them some familiarity to it, hopefully before they experience one in the wild. All right, we've reached the Q&A section. So as always, I will be jumping into Q&A in just a second. Before I do that, I will just quickly touch on, we have the MDR threat brief, which is our weekly kind of threat intelligence brief that goes out in the community. So do jump on over to the community. Make sure you subscribe to the announcements channel where this goes out every week. And it covers a lot of things that we aren't able to touch on in the kind of ThreatCast because so much happens. I mean, literally, we were changing content up until the last minute on this because just things keep, new stories break, new vulnerabilities sort of reprioritize, and so on. All right, so let's go jump into the Q&A. I'm going to shuffle through. Where have I put it? I have that window somewhere. Here it is. Okay, so the first one is, we have SharePoint, but it's in M365, so we're at risk. I assume this is about the SharePoint vulnerability that's gone out. So no, for the cloud managed, instance of SharePoint that's built into sort of the M365 wider platform, those, according to Microsoft, are not vulnerable. It's the on-premise versions, so the ones that you deploy, using your own Windows servers internally. I guess there's kind of the wider advice, because it's not just SharePoint, but any kind of application that is, presents a web interface that you expose to the internet from your environment is always at risk. It doesn't matter if it's SharePoint or if it's an FTP server or if it's an SSH server or it's anything. Anything that you expose to the internet becomes part of your wider attack surface, and it's certainly worth looking at. I know our managed risk team that look at the external attack surface of our customers are always highlighting these kind of various vulnerabilities that crop up in all these technologies. And it's always really good to catalog what you've got exposed, if you have SharePoint or not on premise. Is it exposed to the internet? Is it behind a VPN? All these kind of things. You want to get that documented and make sure you understand it. All right. Next one. Why does Windows allow users to execute commands in the address bar of a file browser? I don't know. This is talking about the sort of the file fix, but it was news to me. I did not know you could run a command, execute a command in the file path address bar of a file window. A very bizarre thing. I wasn't able to identify if there's any group policy things to control that, but yes, certainly a very strange behavior. Let's see. What kinds of mitigations can one implement to protect against users? Sorry, I've misread this. What kind of mitigations can one implement to protect against foreign actors who have gained jobs in third-party suppliers? So this is the sort of like North Korea thing. When we're working with, and I say we, I mean us, all of us. As we're working with any kind of vendor out there, how can we be sure if they don't have a bunch of foreign actors working within them, posing as local nationals in those suppliers? I guess this is kind of the importance of studying all the suppliers that you are using, all the third parties that you work with. Actually conducting a risk assessment of each and every one of them to understand, what are their policies, what are their practices, what's the scope of your relationship with them, how are you interfacing, and so on, to really understand the kind of risks that you're exposing yourself to. Where is that organization based? Are they, a European? Are they American? Do they themselves contract out to other countries? These are things you have to, converse with that vendor. Preferably before you actually sign the contract and engage with them. But again, it's never too late. It's always worth still checking and vetting your suppliers. After that, I guess it's really important to make sure you've got a clear communication channel with your vendors. So if you are engaging with anyone, who do you contact? If you spot something, see something strange or suspicious, what's the contact in that organization? There's nothing worse than being in a situation where, let's say, you observe some suspicious behavior from either an application or an individual from one of these suppliers, and then now you need to go and chase down, well, what's going on here? Who do I communicate with? And you don't want to be maybe stuck in call queues waiting for half an hour. You need to know who do you call or who do you contact in those kind of emergency situations. Another thing as well is minimizing the access and privileges that you grant to any third-party supplier. If you've got a contractor or anyone else that's coming in to do a certain scope of work, limit their access and their privileges to exactly what it is necessary for that scope of work. And of course, finally, monitor them constantly, monitor everything they're doing, log everything and constantly review that. This is how we have to engage with third-party suppliers and how everyone has to as well. That sadly, trust is a difficult thing to establish. And again, you can trust that vendor entirely and they could trust themselves and have all the best policies in place. But as we've seen with recent breaches by some of these major actors, they are getting inside, vendors and so on to effectively pose and as well, they're an insider threat. And so this kind of really highlights the importance of really monitoring that as well. But yeah, cool question. Another one, which is, how do you restrict external Microsoft Teams communications? In the references, I've put a link to, I think it's something that touches on the group policy, or actually it's not because it's Teams, it's in the admin console portal thing. There's a way you can lock this down. Now, if you're already interfacing with, third parties in your MS Teams environment, like you need to communicate with people outside, it's very difficult then to lock down this because you need to maintain that ability to communicate. But if you're just using MS Teams as an internal tool and you do not need the ability for someone outside your organization to pop open a chat with one of your employees, absolutely go and block that. Go check the references at the end of this and go and get that disabled. Nice, easy fix, and certainly will mitigate a lot of phishing attempts like that we're seeing that are abusing MS Teams. I'm just going to quickly review another question that just came in. Regarding the malicious CVs, how was the document modified to execute malicious code, macros, or something more sophisticated? I actually don't know the answer to this one. Does someone? I'll let someone backstage have a quick think and read over that if they want to jump on stage and answer that when they're ready. Another question is, does Sophos detect those malicious SVGs? So I think that's going back to the scalable vector graphics question in the threat hunt. We've actually talked about this in the previous ThreatCast with these SVGs, because an SVG, you would think vector graphics, it's going to be all about making a vector on the screen and doing, nice curves and crisp graphics. But actually, it's ultimately an XML specification. It's just an XML document. And one of the design features of SVG is to enable it to be embedded into the DOM and then manipulated in the DOM, the document object model, I think that's what it's called, inside a web browser. So you can manipulate it, run JavaScript on it, use cascading style sheets to style your SVGs. So it means SVGs can, have embedded in them HTML, JavaScript. It's effectively like an extension of a bit of web code you can dump in. So they're a really weird spec, but historically we did have a number of detections for this. So I grabbed a list of them earlier. We did have some context mail, and which is looking for SVGs in email, which is in Sophos Central Email. There's a number of endpoint behavioral ones and static ones. Also just looking at the whole wider it's an XML-based detection, so it will show up as like Trojan/XML something. I think there's like Trojan PH for fish, Dropper, or what's this, DL download, downloader. So there's a number of them. But of course, we're always looking for more. That's why we're working with our teams constantly to give the more examples of this kind of behaviors we're seeing as the SVG is being abused. And annoyingly, it's not something you can block. You can't just say, do not allow SVGs, because I think that will break a ton of websites, because, it's often used to provide nice logos and crisp graphics without the file size of a PNG or a JPEG or something else. So yeah, it's a really difficult thing to lock down. But thankfully, as it's an XML, it does mean that security products like us can parse that file format and look at the body of it and see what's going on inside it. I'll bring up that other question in a second. I'm not sure if one of my colleagues heard me, but I have another question, which I think, Morgan, I'm going to bring you on stage for. So Morgan, I'll let you come on stage before I ask it so you don't miss the question.
Hello.
Hey, Morgan. So it's kind of a general one, I guess. These phishing kids seem to be rolling the same kinds of attacks for decades at this point. Click here to view your malicious document, etc. Are they really that effective? So I guess this is casting some shade at phishing kids, but I guess it's right. We haven't seen really. I mean, it's the same playbook in a lot of ways for decades. Any reason? Is it effective? What do you guys see in the Intel team in terms of like incidents stemming from these things and so on?
Yes, and I would say that's kind of part of the problem. Phishing, it remains effective not because the tactics are like cutting edge, but more because they don't have to be. These campaigns, they exploit not just technology, but that human behavior. And unfortunately, human behavior hasn't changed nearly as fast as some of our security tooling. When it comes down to it, attackers really only have to be right once. Even if a single user falls for a lure or accidentally accepts a prompt, the attacker is able to gain a foothold. And us as defenders, on the other hand, have to be, essentially right every single time across every user, every endpoint, every control. And when it comes to these phishing kits, like even the basic ones, they've evolved just enough to stay ahead of detection. So now, you've got today's kits, they'll be able to bypass MFA by using, adversary in the middle techniques. They are deploying anti-analysis tools to evade sandboxing. So there is some advancements that you usually see, I think, on the back end to kind of keep up with the security controls that we're developing. But when it comes to actually the lures themselves, they're still pretty basic and they feel familiar because the success rate is still very high. The phishing still works, not because it's new, but because it's good enough to keep working. And I think you'll see some modifications in how attackers are trying to conduct that phishing, abusing fake captchas or fake security alerts, and trying to adopt more modern I guess lures that would lure people in, these HR themed phishing attempts. But at the end of the day, they just have to work enough in order for one person to fall for it. So there's not a real reason for these threat actors to be coming up with new and crazy and innovative ways to compromise people, because they just don't have to at the end of the day, which is unfortunate, but it's hard to catch it sometimes as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came to mind while you're talking is that, I think my computers had countless updates of software this sort of past week alone. I don't remember the last time human beings had a software upgrade. I guess we still have some critical vulnerability stuck inside of us that really is very difficult to patch. I guess that also I guess this is less of a joke comment, but at Sophos, we actually have a yearly, I ask any Sophos employee, we have a yearly training refresher for a whole number of topics from legal, compliance, security, and so on. And we go through the kind of the phishing refresher, every single year, which I think is a really key part, because yes, things evolve, but it's very easy to forget, especially when you don't see a lot of them. I always wonder, with security controls being so effective at mitigating a lot of these things, it means it's only those few that get through, and the people getting enough experience at seeing them, right? And it's almost like we're forgetting what they are. And I guess that sort of final thing as well is that, one of the best mitigations for this is to phish your staff. We still to this day get phishing emails from our own security team on a regular basis for a whole number of different things, all sorts. And some of them are excellent and if not infuriating, which was, my favorite one was where they're effectively saying that, your request for holiday is being denied. Click here to whatever, and I think they sent it out around what was it? Probably around Thanksgiving or something like that, right? And where, of course, a number of employees have made requests to have that time off. And this is the whole problem of pretext, right? Is that, a lot of people are going to have, annual leave around common public holidays. So it's an easy thing to go after. And again, you only have to be right once as an adversary, whereas as a defender, you've got to be right every single time. But yeah. Love it. Great little discussion. All right, we're coming up to the end. I believe that question that was asked, I've got an answer for it, but I'll just read it out from my colleague here. It says, in recent so this is in regards to regarding the malicious CVs, how is the document modified to execute malicious code, macros, or something more sophisticated? And so the answer was, in recent campaigns, we've seen a lot of threat actors using archives or executables that are themed to look like a CV document, but aren't actual documents. One example is using an icon of a PDF for executable files. So something, it would be like CVE_name, .exe, or .pdf.exe. I think we've seen that one quite a lot. In other cases, threat actors have used archives to deliver .lnk, so shortcuts, or .src files to launch malicious code, such as a zip, which will drop an lnk, and then that lnk, which is a shortcut, can point to an external resource, and that could be some payload on the internet, and then it runs that, right? So there's a whole number of things, but I guess it's that problem of that people, when you've got CVs and so on, and an HR person is expecting to receive files, and they're going to expect to be opening these things, it's a really big vector for an attacker to go after, and that's probably why we're seeing such a big uptick in it. All right, we're coming to time, so thank you so much for being here. As always, the references will be made available on the MDR community channel. We've got that link. It was on the previous page. It's on this one here. You can see them all here. Don't panic. All of this will be published to the MDR community channel within the next 24 hours, along with the video recording, the most unwanted image, and the text from the most unwanted image as well, should you want to translate it or reuse it for your own purposes. All right, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. And as always, stay suspicious, stay vigilant. And if you have any concerns about anything that you're observing going on in your estate, do not hesitate to contact the Sophos MDR operations team at your earliest convenience. All right. Thanks so much. You take care.